Ready for a deep dive? Let's talk about a true crime mystery, but with a pretty chilling twist, huh?
Yeah, definitely.
We're going back in time a bit, to the early 1900s, to the shadowy streets of Barcelona.
Ooh,
And the story of Enriqueta Martí,
okay.
maybe better known as the Vampire of Barcelona.
And it's a story that still fascinates people over a century later, right? What I think is so captivating about this era, especially in a place like Barcelona, is that it was a time of such immense societal change. Like, ancient superstitions existed alongside these very modern anxieties.
It's almost like something out of a Gothic novel.
Right.
You've got this bustling city on the edge of a new century.
Yeah.
But then these whispers of disappearances and dark secrets. So paint a picture for us.
Right.
What was Barcelona like in those days, the early 1900s?
Okay, so imagine a city of just stark contrast, right?
Okay.
On the one hand, you've got this really thriving hub of art and culture, like a beacon of modernity. But on the other hand, poverty and disease are totally rampant, especially in this densely populated area. It was known as El Raval.
El Raval.
Yeah, and for the poor, life expectancy was dismally low, and diseases like tuberculosis, or consumption as they called it back then, were a constant threat.
So you've got this backdrop of fear, of uncertainty,
Right.
and then on top of that, you have these rumors swirling about missing children.
Exactly, and these weren't just rumors, they were fueled by this very real sense of unease. I mean, imagine being a parent in these impoverished areas. You're already struggling to keep your kids healthy, to keep them fed, and then on top of that, you have this very real fear that they could just vanish.
And to make matters worse, it wasn't like the authorities were doing anything to ease those fears.
No, not really. In fact, right before our story starts, the city's governor, Manuel Portela Valladares, he's the one who actually publicly dismissed these rumors of missing children as nothing more than fantasy, which, politically speaking, probably wasn't the best move.
Yeah, talk about bad timing. Because that is where Teresita Guitar comes into play.
Exactly. February of 1912, little Teresita Guitar vanishes. Now, this wasn't just another child disappearing, another statistic in a city that was already kind of overrun with poverty and disease. This was different. This was a young girl snatched away, and it felt like it confirmed everyone's worst fears.
The city is on edge. Everyone's looking for answers. So, how does Enriqueta Martí, the Vampire of Barcelona, how does she get connected to Teresita's disappearance?
It's actually a pretty strange twist of fate. It's a neighbor of Enriqueta's, a woman named Claudina Elias, who notices something a little odd.
Oh, I love a good neighborly observation. What'd she see?
So Claudina, she spots this young girl with a shaved head in Enriqueta's window, someone she doesn't recognize. And now, this might not seem like a huge detail,
Okay.
but you gotta remember, Enriqueta was kind of an enigma. She wasn't known to have children, at least not openly.
Well, except for Angelita. Didn't she have a young girl living with her?
That's right, she did. But even then, no one really knew much about Angelita, So when this unfamiliar face pops up in the window, it piqued Claudina's curiosity, and she contacts the authorities. And you know what? Good thing she did. That one seemingly small act uncovers something much more sinister.
They find Teresita. She was at Enriqueta's place.
She was hidden away in this cramped, dimly lit apartment, along with Angelita.
Wow.
And if that wasn't unsettling enough, there's another layer to this very disturbing puzzle. There was a young boy, Pepito, that neighbors had seen with Enriqueta, and he was nowhere to be found.
Okay, so 2 children are found in this woman's apartment, one of whom was reported missing, and now another child, a young boy, is also missing. Definitely not looking good for our Vampire of Barcelona. But where does the whole vampire thing even come in? What made people start associating her with something so sinister?
Well, it's a bunch of factors, honestly. Remember those rumors about missing children? Those rumors were often mixed with these whispers of something even darker. Stories of wealthy people using children's blood in some desperate attempt to cure tuberculosis.
So like a real-life horror story playing out against this backdrop of this rapidly changing city.
Exactly. And then, get this, when the police searched Enriqueta's apartment, they didn't just find Teresita and Angelita, they found jars. And these jars were filled with what looked like human remains.
Oh, wow. No wonder people called her the Vampire of Barcelona. That's a whole other level of creepy. Okay, we're going to have to leave it right there, but I am hooked.
Right.
Who is Enriqueta Martí? What about those jars? Were they really what the police thought they were?
What kind of person keeps those kinds of things around?
Exactly. Who was Enriqueta Martí?
Well, that is the million-dollar question, isn't it? The sources paint a pretty complicated picture of her. Let's see, she was born in 1868, so at the time of her arrest, she would have been in her early 40s. And back then, that meant she had probably already lived a few lifetimes.
Yeah, I bet.
She'd worked a bunch of different jobs. Domestic servant, she even tried selling lace and ribbons, apparently ones she made herself.
Wow, that's quite a range. She sounds like a real chameleon, adapting to whatever came her way.
And that's key here. This ability to move between different worlds, that was Enriqueta. Because during the day, you'd see her begging on the streets of El Raval, blending right in.
Just another face in the crowd.
Exactly. But then night rolled around. Different story entirely.
Ooh, a secret life. I bet the newspapers back then went crazy for that.
Oh, absolutely. They ate it up. Imagine. One minute, she's this almost invisible figure, then poof, she's stepping out of carriages all decked out in fancy clothes, on her way to the theater, or, get this, the casino. They called her the Woman of Two Faces.
Which, honestly, is a perfect title. But that kind of double life must have given her access to all sorts of people, rich and poor. Did the police ever find out who she was connected to?
That's just it. Very little concrete info about her life survived. What we do know is that her past was, well, let's say tumultuous. She was married for a bit to this painter, Joan Pujolo.
Okay.
But it fell apart because, and this is according to the stories, she just couldn't stay away from prostitution.
So definitely familiar with Barcelona's underbelly then. But what about those accusations? I mean, we're talking child abduction. And even worse, making those blood potions. Was there any truth to those?
Here's where things get murky. Remember those jars we talked about?
The ones that supposedly had human remains.
Those very jars. So, more recent investigations. Well, let's just say that forensic science back then wasn't what it is today.
Yeah, no fancy DNA tests back then.
Exactly. They were working with, like, a magnifying glass at best. So while the police were totally convinced they'd found evidence of something truly awful, later on, a journalist named Jordi Corominas took another look, and he said a lot of those remains, they were animal bones.
Animal bones? Are you saying the whole Vampire of Barcelona thing was just exaggeration?
Not necessarily. You got to remember, back then, people believed in superstition, in folklore. It was part of life, especially for the poor.
Right.
And even if some of those bones were from animals, children were still going missing.
And people needed someone to blame. Someone like the Vampire of Barcelona. But if those more sensational parts of the story weren't true, what was Enriqueta Martí actually guilty of? Some of that evidence against Enriqueta Martí wasn't exactly a slam dunk.
Right.
But, you know, those missing children, what happened with that? And what about Enriqueta? Was she ever actually held accountable for anything?
Yeah, those missing kids, they're the heart of this whole thing, aren't they? Even if we say, okay, some of those details, maybe they were misinterpreted. Teresita Guitart was found in Enriqueta's home, and Pepito, he just disappeared.
And we can't forget Angelita either, the girl who was living with her. What happened to her?
Oh man, Angelita's story is just, it's tragic. After they arrested Enriqueta, Angelita ended up in an orphanage, which, sadly, wasn't uncommon back then. There are actually a few different stories about what happened to her later on. Some people say she lived a long life, but under a new name. But to be honest, it seems like she disappears from any records pretty soon after that whole trial.
Wow.
It's just another sad part of this whole sad story.
Yeah. But going back to Enriqueta, even without some of that more out there evidence, it sounds like the police still had a decent case against her, right? Especially with Teresita.
Absolutely. Kidnapping alone, that's serious. But here's the thing. Enriqueta Martí, she died in prison.
Hold on, she died, but before they could even have a trial.
Go for trial, yeah.
Okay, I gotta ask, was there any foul play suspected? Because this whole story is so wild, it makes you wonder.
Oh, for sure. The rumors were flying. Some people said she was silenced, you know, to protect those high society folks she was supposedly making those potions for. Others said maybe her fellow inmates took care of her.
Ooh, at the behest of those same rich folks, you mean? Now that would be a story. Although with a name like the Vampire of Barcelona,
Yeah.
I wouldn't imagine she was making too many friends in prison.
Yeah.
So what was it? What actually happened to her?
The official cause, uterine cancer. And it's easy to jump to conclusions, I get it, but uterine cancer was pretty common back then, especially for women living in poverty.
Right.
And those prison conditions, absolutely awful.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's not that far-fetched.
Okay. That makes sense. But still, it's almost too convenient, right? She dies before they even get to trial.
Yeah.
No chance to get any answers, no dramatic confession. It's almost like the ending of a Gothic novel.
It does kind of feel theatrical, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But you're right, where she died, that was basically it. Case closed, no trial, no big reveals. Enriqueta Martí, the Vampire of Barcelona, she took all those secrets with her.
So what does that mean for us? What are we even supposed to think about this whole story?
That's what makes this whole thing so fascinating, right? Was she really a cold-blooded killer? Like a true monster who targeted the most helpless people? Or was she a scapegoat? Someone the public could blame because they were dealing with a whole bunch of other problems. I mean, think about it. Poverty, disease. Those were like supernatural forces back then.
Especially with people thinking the wealthy and powerful could get away with anything.
Exactly. So was Enriqueta just an easy target?
It really makes you think, how many other stories like this are out there? Stories where truth and legend kind of get all mixed up.
You know, these kinds of stories, true crime that becomes legend, they're like mirrors. We see our own fears reflected back at us. The truth about Enriqueta, about those missing children, it's out there somewhere, buried under years of people talking and speculating.
And maybe even a little bit of made-up stuff.
Oh, absolutely. And that's what makes Enriqueta Martí, the Vampire of Barcelona, so fascinating. She's an enigma. A reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones we create.